7 Formula One World Championships, 79 Grand Prix victories, a factory built on a Norfolk bomber base where the man who couldn't pass his maths exam created the lightest, fastest racing cars Britain has ever produced, the Esprit that James Bond drove into the sea, the ground effect revolution that changed motorsport forever. Then the pipeline, millions of pounds of British taxpayers' money, intended for jobs in war-torn Belfast, routed through a Geneva shell company to a post office box in Panama. A cocaine bust in a Los Angeles hotel room. An FBI manhunt. A heart attack at 54, weeks before the arrest warrant arrived. Today, the factory has cut more than half its workforce. It has never been sustainably profitable. A 2-ton Chinese-built electric SUV bears the badge of a man who believed subtracting weight made you faster everywhere. This is the story of Colin Chapman, the publican's son who built a legend from a lock-up garage, stole a fortune from the people who needed it most, and died before anyone could make him answer for it. Genius, fraud, and the test track that outlasted them all. Chapter 1. The Publican's Son. The story begins behind a pub. Not a country pub with horse brasses and a log fire. A railway pub, the Railway Hotel on Tottenham Lane, next to Hornsey Station in North London. Stanley Chapman ran the place. His son Colin, born in Richmond in 1928, grew up above the bar and built his first car in the stables out the back, the lock-up garage behind a girlfriend's parents' house in Muswell Hill, the stable block behind his father's pub. These were the birthplaces of a company that would win 7 Formula One World Championships and produce some of the most beautiful machines Britain has ever made. Anthony Colin. Bruce Chapman, his initials stamped into the Lotus badge from the very first day, attended Stationers' Company's school in Hornsey, then enrolled at University College London to study structural engineering. He failed his final mathematics paper in 1948. Failed it. The man who would go on to revolutionise the physics of racing cars couldn't pass his maths exam. He joined the RAF briefly, turned down a permanent commission, went back, sat the paper again, and scraped his degree in 1949. His day job afterwards was selling aluminium as a structural material for British aluminium. Nothing about this biography suggested genius. Everything about it suggested a restless young man who hadn't yet found the thing that would consume him. He found it in 1948, the same year he failed that exam. The first Lotus was a modified 1930 Austin 7, registered OX9292, stripped of its saloon body, and fitted with a lighter structure for mud-plugging trials. It was crude, it was basic, and it was built on a principle that Chapman would spend the rest of his life refining and the rest of the motor industry would spend decades trying to copy. Take weight out. His maxim, simplify then add lightness, has no traceable original source. Nobody can find it in print before it became legend. But the philosophy was there from that first butchered Austin. Adding power makes you faster on the straights, subtracting weight makes you faster everywhere. The woman who made it possible was Hazel Williams. Chapman met her at a dance at Hornsey Town Hall in 1944. She was 17, he was 16. Her parents disapproved so strongly they moved house to get away from him. It didn't work. When Chapman was commissioned into the RAF, it was Hazel who kept building the car, the Lotus Mark I and Mark II, assembled with her own hands. She wasn't the supportive wife standing behind the great man. She was mechanically capable, competed as a driver in trials and sprints, and on occasion outpaced Colin himself. In February 1953, she contributed £25, a good month's wages, to form the working capital of the Lotus Engineering Company. £25. That was the entire financial foundation of what became a Formula One dynasty, a cultural icon, and eventually the centre of one of the most elaborate frauds in British industrial history. They married in October 1954 at Northaw Church. The wedding vehicle was a converted Bedford bus, the Team Lotus transporter. The name Lotus itself remains unexplained. The most popular theory is that it was Chapman's pet name for Hazel. Chapman once claimed he'd simply seen the word on a bathroom tap. Nobody ever pinned him down on it, and he seemed to enjoy the mystery. His personality was something else entirely. Peter Waugh, who managed Team Lotus, put it best. His most annoying characteristic was that he was almost always right. When Chapman came in with one of his brainwaves, you'd think, he's really gone off his rocker this time. And 9 times out of 10, the bugger would turn out to be right. But when he did get it wrong, he made some big ones. Biographer Mike Lawrence was less generous, calling Chapman a man with the business ethics of a 1950s spiv, who used dangerous drugs to maintain a crushing schedule and ruthlessly stole other men's ideas. Both descriptions were accurate. They described the same person. Chapman was a chameleon, remembered differently by everyone who knew him. Charismatic, irascible, brilliant, and dangerous. The kind of man who could charm you into working 18-hour days and then take credit for the breakthrough you'd made at 3 in the morning. The kind of man who could sketch a revolutionary racing car on a restaurant napkin and explain, with absolute conviction, why every established engineer in the world was wrong. The kind of man who would, within 2 decades, be facing a prison sentence of at least 10 years for fraud so brazen that the judge who would have sentenced him called it barefaced, outrageous, and massive. But that was later. In the early 1950s, he was just a young man building cars behind a pub, with a £25 investment from the woman who loved him and a conviction that lightness was everything. Chapter 2. Simplify, then add lightness. The operation that grew out of those lock-up garages was built on partnerships as much as on Chapman's own brilliance. He had the vision. He needed people who could make it real. Mike Costin was a de Havilland aircraft engineer who joined Lotus part-time in 1953 and became technical director. His brother Frank, also from de Havilland, designed the aerodynamic bodies of the Lotus Mark 8, Mark 9, and 11. Shapes drawn from aircraft principles that gave Lotus enormous advantages in sports car racing. Frank Costin was the first person to use a NACA duct on a car. The aviation connection wasn't incidental, it was foundational. Chapman thought like an aircraft designer, minimum structure, maximum strength-to-weight ratio, and he surrounded himself with people who'd actually designed aircraft. Keith Duckworth arrived in 1957, an Imperial College graduate who'd been grounded during RAF national service for what was officially described as dangerous and incompetent flying. Chapman hired him as a gearbox development engineer. The following year, Costin and Duckworth co-founded their own company in a small garage in Frere Barnet. They called it Cosworth, Costin plus Duckworth. Chapman later persuaded Ford to bankroll Duckworth's design for an F1 engine with £100,000. The result was the Cosworth DFV, possibly the most successful racing engine ever built. It would power Formula One for over a decade and win 155 Grand Prix. Graham Hill, before becoming a double world champion, talked his way into a Lotus mechanic's job around 1955 and essentially worked his way from underneath the cars into the cockpit. Ron Hickman designed the Lotus Elan and later became famous as the inventor of the Black & Decker workmate. A small detail that captures something essential about the Lotus orbit. These were people of extraordinary practical ingenuity who happened to converge on a small operation in North London. By June 1959, a ban on industrial development in London forced the company out of Hornsey. Lotus moved to Delamere Road, Cheshunt, Hertfordshire, roughly 10 miles up the A10, with 30 employees. At Cheshunt, Chapman built the cars that established the legend. The Lotus 7 appeared in 1957, sold as a kit for £536 to avoid purchase tax. Buyers received the components and assembled the car themselves. Caterham still makes a derivative today, nearly 70 years later. The Lotus Elite, the Type 14, the world's first fiberglass monocoque production car, debuted at the 1957 Earl's Court Motor Show. It weighed just 673 kilograms with a drag coefficient of 0.29. Extraordinary for its era. It was also a financial disaster. Lotus reportedly lost £100 on every single one of the roughly 1,030 built. This was the pattern that would define the company for its entire existence. Engineering brilliance subsidised by financial recklessness. The cars were always better than the business that made them. Chapman understood weight, stress, aerodynamics, and structural efficiency with an intuition that bordered on genius. He did not understand, or did not care about, profit margins, cash flow, or the obligations that come with other people's money. The revolutionary Lotus 25 was also born at Cheshunt. Chapman sketched the concept on napkins during dinner with Frank Costin, the first monocoque Formula One car, its structure built into the skin rather than hung on a frame. When rival constructor John Cooper first saw it at Zandvoort in 1962, he asked Chapman where he'd put the frame tubes. There were no frame tubes. The aluminium monocoque was 3 times stiffer than a conventional space frame while weighing half as much. Mechanic Dick Scammell admitted the truth of it. None of us really knew what we were doing, but it all took shape very nicely. It was, arguably, the grandfather of every modern Grand Prix car. Team Lotus entered Formula One at the 1958 Monaco Grand Prix. The first victory came when Stirling Moss won at Monaco in 1960, in a privately entered Lotus 18. The first works victory followed when Innes Ireland won the 1961 United States Grand Prix. Within 3 years of entering the sport, Lotus was winning races against teams with 10 times the budget and 50 times the history. But Cheshunt was already too small. Chapman needed more space, and he needed something no amount of money could buy in suburban Hertfordshire: a test track. Chapter 3: Where the Liberators Flew. When Cheshunt's local council rejected his expansion plans, Chapman took a map of the United Kingdom, drew a circle with a 100-mile radius from central London, and looked for a decommissioned airfield. He found Hethel, on the edge of Norfolk. He flew his own plane down, landed on the abandoned runway, and saw everything he needed: 2 runways in an X shape that could become a test track, existing buildings, 55 acres of space, and a local workforce skilled in fiberglass from Norfolk's leisure boat building industry. The site had a history that Chapman probably didn't dwell on. RAF Hethel had been built in 1942 as USA AAF Station 114. The 389th Bombardment Group, nicknamed the Sky Scorpions, arrived from Colorado on June 11, 1943, with 4 squadrons of B-24 Liberator bombers. At peak, the base housed nearly 3,000 servicemen. They flew 321 missions over occupied Europe and lost 116 Liberators in action. 588 personnel were killed or went missing. The 389th participated in Operation Tidal Wave, the devastating low-level raid on the Ploesti oil refineries in Romania on August 1, 1943, one of the most costly air operations of the entire war. Second Lieutenant Lloyd Hughes was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for pressing home his attack with his aircraft on fire. The Americans left in May 1945. The base closed in 1948 and lay largely abandoned for nearly 2 decades, the concrete runways cracking in the Norfolk frost, the control tower empty, the dispersal bays where young men had waited to fly to their deaths slowly being reclaimed by bramble and grass. Chapman laid the foundation stone in July 1966 and moved the entire operation from Cheshunt over a single weekend in November. The test track, built on portions of the 2 runways and the perimeter road, stretched 2.2 miles and was 40 feet wide. Every great Lotus driver would test on this same strip of concrete where B-24s once lined up for bombing raids. The former control tower became the clubhouse overlooking the track. A memorial to the 389th sits nearby, a former gymnasium where a crucifix painted by American serviceman Bud Doyle in early 1944 still adorns the wall. The first all-new car manufactured at Hethel was the Lotus Europa, the world's first mass-produced mid-engined road car, weighing just 610 kilograms. A total of 9,230 were built. The Elan, designed by Ron Hickman with its revolutionary backbone chassis, had already sold over 17,000 examples. Lotus's first genuine commercial success. But the introduction of VAT in April 1973 killed the kit car cost advantage that had been central to Lotus's economics since the 7. The company would need another way to make money. Chapman, as always, had ideas. Not all of them were legal. Chapter 4. Black and Gold. The golden age at Hethel was built on two things: Formula One dominance and a single road car that seduced James Bond. Jim Clark was the driver who made it happen. A quiet Scottish farmer's son from Kilmeny in Fife, Clark was spotted by Chapman at a Boxing Day race at Brands Hatch in late 1958. He became Chapman's greatest driver and closest friend, perhaps the deepest relationship between any driver and team principal in the sport's history, as one writer described it. Clark won 25 Grand Prix, a record at the time. He won the 1965 Indianapolis 500, becoming the first non-American winner in 49 years. In 1963, he won 7 of 10 championship races in the Lotus 25, an unprecedented domination that no team had achieved before and few have matched since. Team Lotus accumulated 79 Grand Prix victories and 7 Constructors' Championships across 2 decades. The first constructor to reach 50 wins, beating even Ferrari. But Chapman's cars were light. Light meant fast. Light also meant fragile. And fragile, in Formula One, meant death. Clark was killed on the 7th of April 1968 at Hockenheim during a Formula 2 race. His Lotus 48 left the track and struck a tree. He was 32. Chapman wasn't present. He was devastated and publicly stated he'd lost his best friend. Graham Hill, the mechanic who'd talked his way into the cockpit, pulled the heartbroken team together and won the 1968 championship, dedicating it to Clark's memory. Death stalked Chapman's drivers with grim regularity. Jochen Rindt, an Austrian who joined Lotus in 1969, had told friends before signing his contract, "At Lotus, I can either be world champion or die." He won 4 consecutive races in the revolutionary Lotus 72 in 1970, then was killed during practice at Monza on the 5th of September. A suspected brake shaft failure sent his car into barriers. Rindt, who refused to wear the crotch strap of his harness, slid forward in the cockpit. The seatbelt buckle cut his throat. He was 34. He remains Formula One's only posthumous world champion. No rival could match his points total with 4 races still remaining. In 1968, Chapman had made another move that changed the sport forever. He introduced commercial sponsorship to Formula One. The first livery was gold leaf red and gold. In 1972, it evolved into the iconic John Player Special Black and Gold, a tobacco brand created specifically for Lotus. The livery ran for 15 seasons and won 3 Constructors' and 2 Drivers' Championships. It remains the most recognisable colour scheme in the history of motor racing. Meanwhile, the Lotus Esprit had become something else entirely. Designed by Giorgetto Giugiaro of Ital Design and unveiled at the 1972 Turin Motor Show, it was already a striking car. But what made it immortal was a piece of opportunism worthy of Chapman himself. Lotus PR manager Don McLaughlin strategically parked a pre-production Esprit outside Pinewood Studios. Bond producer Albert Cubby Broccoli spotted it. The deal for The Spy Who Loved Me was sealed with a handshake. The underwater submarine car was built by Perry Oceanographic of Florida for over £100,000, driven by retired Navy SEAL Don Griffin in full scuba gear. When an extra road car was needed for chase sequences, the crew borrowed Chapman's own Esprit. In 2013, Elon Musk paid nearly $1 million for the submarine prop and reportedly used it as design inspiration for the Tesla Cybertruck. The Esprit's backbone chassis, designed at Hethel, derived from Ron Hickman's Elan platform, was elegant, effective, and about to become central to a story Chapman never intended anyone to hear. But not yet. In 1977, the Esprit was simply a beautiful car that James Bond drove into the sea. And Colin Chapman was about to have his finest hour. Chapter 5. Painted to the Road. The ultimate expression of Chapman's genius arrived in the form of upside-down aircraft wings bolted to a racing car. Ground effect aerodynamics emerged after Chapman studied the de Havilland Mosquito's wing-mounted radiators and realized that, inverted, the same principle could generate massive downforce, pressing the car onto the track without adding weight. He presented a 27-page document to engineering director Tony Rudd in August 1975. Aerodynamicist Peter Wright developed the concept. Ralph Bellamy drew the Lotus WWII 78. Martin Ogilvy designed the perfected Lotus AN 79. The side pods were shaped as inverted aerofoils, sealed to the ground with sliding skirts. Mario Andretti described driving the 78 as feeling painted to the road. The Lotus 79 produced approximately 30% more downforce than its predecessor and was reportedly the first Formula One car designed using computer aids. Andretti won the 1978 World Championship with 6 victories, clinching at Monza. It was the high water mark, Chapman's philosophy of lightness and aerodynamic purity, taken to its ultimate conclusion, vindicated on the grandest stage in motorsport. But the triumph at Monza was shadowed by horror. Teammate Ronnie Peterson was caught in a 10-car pile-up at the first chicane. His Lotus was torn apart and engulfed in flames. James Hunt helped pull him from the wreckage. Peterson suffered approximately 27 fractures in his legs, but was initially expected to survive. Fat embolism and kidney failure killed him overnight. He was 34. Andretti later said, "It's always going to overshadow what could have been the most satisfying day of my life. To lose Ronnie was to lose family." At its peak in 1978, Hethel produced 1,200 cars, 553 Esprits, 354 Eclats, 293 Elites. By 1980, production had crashed to just 383. A catastrophic 68% decline in 2 years, driven by fuel crises, inflation and American emissions regulations that locked Lotus out of its largest export market. The total 10,675 Esprits built across the model's entire 28-year production run gives you the measure of how small this company always was. A cottage industry masquerading as a global brand. That was the summit. The black and gold Lotus 79 dominating the world. The Esprit on cinema screens. Chapman's name spoken alongside Ferrari and Porsche. What nobody outside a very small circle knew was that Colin Chapman had already begun building something else entirely. Not a car, not an engine, not an innovation. A pipeline. A pipeline that ran from Belfast through Geneva to a post office box in Panama. And through it, millions of pounds of British taxpayers' money were about to disappear. Chapter 6. The Man from Detroit. John Zachary DeLorean was born on January 6, 1925 in Detroit to a Romanian immigrant father who worked at Ford. He rose through General Motors to become the youngest division chief in the company's history, head of Pontiac at 40, creator of the legendary 1964 GTO, the car that essentially invented the American muscle car market. He was tall, silver-haired, charismatic, and absolutely certain that he was the most talented man in any room he entered. He resigned from GM in 1973 and founded the DeLorean Motor Company with a vision of building an ethical sports car, a vehicle that would last, that wouldn't rust, that would stand as a rebuke to the planned obsolescence he believed had corrupted the American automobile industry. He needed a factory. He needed engineers. And above all, he needed other people's money. DeLorean first invited Lotus to examine his car in the summer of 1978. Chapman and Lotus. Managing Director Mike Kimberly flew to Phoenix, Arizona to see the second prototype. They thought it was abominable. DeLorean had already been turned down by Porsche, too expensive, too slow, and by BMW. He offered Chapman $12 million to re-engineer the car. Chapman declined. When DeLorean raised the offer to $17.5 million, Lotus finance director Fred Bushell convinced Chapman to accept. But Bushell added one critical condition. The funds must be paid up front. Not into Lotus's accounts, into Chapman's offshore account. That condition is the hinge on which everything turns. The genuine engineering work that followed was extraordinary. Colin Spooner, Chapman's protégé, led the Lotus team. Jim Prentice assembled the engineering group. They replaced DeLorean's unworkable plastics monocoque with a steel backbone chassis, essentially a variant of the Esprit platform, the same architecture that had carried James Bond beneath the waves. They integrated Giugiaro's stainless steel body panels over a fiberglass underbody constructed using Lotus's patented Vari process. The work was real. The car was real. And Lotus billed DeLorean Motor Company directly for all of it, approximately $23 million through a completely separate, legitimate payment channel. The $17.5 million that Bushell had insisted be paid up front went somewhere else entirely. Chapter 7. A Post Office Box in Geneva. In October 1978, Chapman and DeLorean met in Geneva and set in motion a fraud so simple in its mechanics that its audacity is almost difficult to believe. Chapman and Bushell had acquired a Panama-registered, Geneva-based shell company called General Product Development Services, GPD. It had no assets, no offices, no employees. Its entire physical presence was a post office box in Geneva and the apartment of Marie-Denise Yuhan, a car importer and dealer in precious stones. Her husband, Yaroslav Jerry Yuhan, a former Porsche racing driver and Lotus employee, was described after his death in 2011 as a knowledgeable intermediary with the mysterious world of Swiss banking. That description does a great deal of work. DeLorean transferred $17.5 million to GPD. $5.1 million came directly from DMC Limited, which is to say, directly from British government funds earmarked for the Belfast factory. The remainder came from the DeLorean Research Limited Partnership, a US investment vehicle whose backers included Sammy Davis Jr., Johnny Carson, author Ira Levin, Pan Am chairman Juan Trippe, and country singer Roy Clark. Celebrities and businessmen who believed they were investing in an ethical sports car. Their money flowed from New York to Geneva, then through banks in Panama, Liberia, New York, and Michigan before arriving in the personal accounts of DeLorean, Chapman, and Bushell. Of the $17.5 million paid to GPD, precisely $137,167 ever reached Lotus. The rest simply disappeared into a parallel world of offshore accounts, split approximately 50% to DeLorean, 45% to Chapman, and 5% to Bushell. Between April 1979 and December 1981, a further £11.5 million was paid to GPD for what was described as technical development. The total fraud amounted to roughly $28 to $30 million at contemporary exchange rates. Chapman concealed every penny of it from the Lotus board of directors. To understand the scale, you have to understand what that money was supposed to be for. Roy Mason, Labour's Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, was the political force behind the DeLorean factory. West Belfast had approximately 50% male unemployment during the Troubles. Mason saw DeLorean as a chance to create jobs in one of the most deprived communities in Western Europe. And, as he put it, deal a hammer blow to the IRA. He overrode internal warnings and secured cabinet approval in just 46 days. The factory was announced on the 3rd of August 1978 to be built at the Cuts, Dunmurry, on 72 acres of marshland between Republican Twinbrook and Unionist Dunmurry. The total British government investment reached approximately £77 million, £53 million in the initial commitment, £14 million in additional loans in 1980, and a £10 million bank guarantee in 1981. Classified cabinet minutes released in 1996 confirmed that ministers had ignored clear warnings about the risks. The money came from the British taxpayer. It was intended to bring work and hope to a community torn apart by sectarian violence. And millions of it ended up in Colin Chapman's offshore accounts, routed through a shell company whose entire existence was a woman's apartment and a post office box. The first production DMC-12 rolled off the Dunmurry line on the 21st of January 1981. The factory employed 2,500 workers, many of whom had never held a job before. They built a car engineered by Lotus, financed by the British government, and conceived by a man who was simultaneously stealing from all of them. Auditors Arthur Anderson examined the books twice and picked up evidence of the fraud both times. They failed to alert the government on either occasion. The firm was eventually banned from government contracts and paid $35 million in settlement to the UK government in 1997. Then a further $27.75 million to 260 creditors in 1999. The House of Commons. Public Accounts Committee, later called the DeLorean Project. One of the gravest cases of the misuse of public resources, a shocking misappropriation of public and private money. That verdict, damning as it is, was delivered in the calm language of parliamentary procedure. On the factory floor in Dunmurry, the language would have been rather different. Chapter 8. It's Better Than Gold. The unravelling began in 1982, and once it started, it moved with a speed that consumed everything in its path. DeLorean Motor Company was placed in receivership in February 1982. Sir Kenneth Cork, former Lord Mayor of London, and in one of those ironies that seem to haunt this story, the man who had originally opposed the DeLorean deal as chairman of the Northern Ireland Development Agency, was appointed receiver. Production at Dunmurry ceased in May. The car had never sold in the numbers needed to sustain the factory. The stainless steel panels were beautiful, but the performance couldn't match the price. American dealers had inventory they couldn't shift. The recession bit. The dream of an ethical sports car died on the spreadsheet, as commercial dreams so often do. But DeLorean wasn't ready to let it go. He'd been a division chief at General Motors. He'd created the GTO. He didn't fail. Other people failed. He just needed more money. James Timothy Hoffman was a convicted drug smuggler turned FBI informant who had been DeLorean's neighbour in Palmer Valley, California. Hoffman arranged a meeting. On October 19, 1982, DeLorean flew to Suite 501 of the Sheraton Plaza Hotel near Los Angeles International Airport. The room had been wired for audio and video by the FBI. A suitcase containing 55 pounds of cocaine, 25 kilograms, was placed on the table. DeLorean inspected it. "It's better than gold," he said. Then he raised a champagne glass in a toast. FBI agent Jerry West entered the room. "Hi, John. I'm Jerry West from the FBI. You're under arrest." DeLorean spent 10 days in Los Angeles County Jail before posting $2.5 million in bond. The drug deal, a desperate attempt to generate funds to save his company, was not directly connected to the GPD financial fraud. But both crimes flowed from the same well. The same conviction that the rules applied to other people. The same belief that audacity could substitute for honesty. The same refusal to accept that the thing he'd built was already lost. On the same day DeLorean was arrested, the British government announced the final closure of the Dunmurry factory. 2,500 people lost their jobs. Many had never worked before, recruited from communities where employment was a rumour from another era. Many never worked again. Union official Brendan Mashin said, "I think it's completely immoral for John DeLorean, that he was dealing in drugs. I think it's equally immoral for 2,000 people to be put on the dole whenever we have a viable proposition." Barry Willis, DeLorean's director of purchasing, compared the factory to the Titanic. The ship and the car were both failures, but they were both glorious failures. The workers on the line in Dunmurry might not have found the comparison comforting. Back at Hethel, the Inland Revenue imposed an £84 million protective assessment on Lotus and all its assets. Production had already crashed to 32 cars per month. From 1980 to 1983, Lotus didn't sell a single car in the United States, its largest export market, closed off by emissions regulations. Most observers expected the company to fold within months. Chapter 9. The Heart Attack. Exactly 2 months after DeLorean's arrest, on the night of the 16th of December 1982, Colin Chapman suffered a fatal heart attack at his home in Norfolk. He was 54 years old. Investigators were reportedly days away from arriving at Lotus to probe the missing money. At Fred Bushell's later trial, Lord Justice Murray stated that Chapman would have received a sentence of at least 10 years for what the judge called a barefaced, outrageous and massive fraud. He never stood trial. He never faced a jury. He never answered a single question about the post office box in Geneva, the money from Belfast, or the shell company with no assets and no employees. The greatest innovator in the history of British motorsport died in his bed before anyone with a warrant could reach him. The funeral was held within days, so quickly that former champions Emerson Fittipaldi and Mario Andretti called from America to attend, but were told Chapman had already been buried. Chapman had recently passed a full medical. Chapman had recently passed a full medical examination at Lloyd's for his pilot's licence. A local churchyard caretaker's wife reportedly said the date of death appeared altered in parish records, and that the doctor who drew up the death certificate disappeared into thin air soon afterwards. The FBI sent agents to Brazil to search for Chapman, based on speculation that he'd undergone plastic surgery and was living under a false identity. Hazel Chapman, who had not travelled for a decade, made a month-long visit to Brazil in 1983. The conspiracy theories remain almost certainly false. The FBI never placed Chapman on their wanted list. His death certificate and coroner's report supported natural causes. Mike Lawrence's biography documented that Chapman had used amphetamines and barbiturates for at least 20 years. Prescribed by his physician to manage a crushing schedule of international travel. A man running on stimulants and sedatives for 2 decades, carrying the stress of a fraud that was closing in on him from every direction. The heart attack requires no conspiracy to explain. Bernie Ecclestone, when asked what happened to Colin Chapman, answered with characteristic ambiguity, "I wish I knew." Chapter 10. The Man Who Stayed Silent. 3 trials followed Chapman's death. Each one illuminated the fraud from a different angle. None of them produced the full truth. DeLorean's drug trial lasted 62 days in 1984 before Judge Robert Takasugi in Los Angeles. Defense attorney Howard Weitzman destroyed the prosecution's case by proving entrapment. The FBI had used Hoffman, a convicted criminal, to lure DeLorean into a crime he might never have committed without the informant's encouragement. The jury acquitted unanimously. DeLorean, never one to underplay a moment, quipped, "Would you buy a used car from me?" His fraud trial followed in October 1986 in Detroit, before Judge Julian Abel Cook, Jr. Chief Prosecutor Joseph Papelian charged DeLorean with defrauding more than 140 investors of $8.5 million. DeLorean's defense was devastatingly simple. The money was a legitimate personal loan from Colin Chapman. Chapman was dead. The prosecution could not call him to the stand. They could not cross-examine a corpse. DeLorean was acquitted of all 15 counts. That left Fred Bushell. Bushell's story is perhaps the most human thread in the entire saga. He was a chartered accountant who had discovered Lotus by chance in the early 1950s. Walking past the Railway Hotel in Hornsey, he noticed unusual cars being built in the stable block and introduced himself to Chapman. For 30 years he served as Chapman's right-hand man, finance director, confidant, fixer. After Chapman's death, it was Bushell who took over as chairman and averted Lotus's immediate collapse in early 1983. He stepped down in October 1983 to allow new investors to take control. Police couldn't raid his properties until the 1988 Criminal Justice Act changed the law. Raids in February 1989 yielded thousands of documents. Bushell was arrested in July 1989 and flown to Belfast. At trial in June 1992 at Belfast Crown Court, he pleaded guilty to conspiring with Chapman and others to defraud DeLorean Motor Company of over £5 million. He was sentenced to 3 years imprisonment, fined £1.5 million, and ordered to pay costs exceeding $800,000. Unable to pay the fine, he served an extra year, approximately 4 years in total. What Bushell knew, and what he never said, defines the man. He knew exactly where all the money had gone. Every transfer, every account, every routing through Panama and Liberia and Geneva. He could have mapped the entire pipeline in an afternoon. He never said a word. He never implicated Chapman. He never explained the routing. He never cooperated with investigators. He walked into Belfast Crown Court, pleaded guilty, and served his time in silence. Some called it loyalty. Others called it obstruction. Bushell himself never characterised it publicly. After his release, he returned to the Lotus community, became a director of classic Team Lotus, remained close to Clive and Hazel Chapman until his death on 14th January 2006, aged 78. Whatever bargain he'd struck with himself, whatever debt he believed he owed to the dead man who'd built cars behind a pub, he honoured it to the end. DeLorean declared bankruptcy in 1999. He was buried on the 19th of March 2005 in blue jeans and a black motorcycle jacket, playing the rebel to the end, aged 80. With all three principals dead by 2006, the full truth of the GPD money trail died with them. The £77 million that the British taxpayer lost on DeLorean, the 2,500 jobs that vanished in Dunmurry, the careers destroyed, the communities hollowed out, all of it orbiting a post office box in Geneva that no longer exists, controlled by men who no longer exist, for reasons that can no longer be explained under oath. Chapter 11. The test track that outlasted them all. Lotus survived. That sentence sounds simple. It wasn't. David Wickens, founder of British Car Auctions, was introduced to the company via Mark Thatcher, the Prime Minister's son, and took a 29% stake. He recruited investors, stabilised the books, and earned the title the Saviour of Lotus. Toyota took a 22.5% stake, providing vital components and cash. General Motors acquired a controlling interest in January 1986 for approximately $20 million, eventually reaching 91%. GM provided stability and used Lotus engineering to develop the Corvette ZE R1's engine. But the front-wheel drive Elan M100 was crushed in the market by the Mazda MX-5. A car that owed its philosophy to Chapman's original Elan but came from a company that could build 100,000 of them rather than 4,000. GM accumulated roughly £50 million in losses and sold Lotus in August 1993 for $30 million to Romano Artioli, an Italian entrepreneur who also owned Bugatti. Artioli's critical contribution was commissioning the car that saved the company. The Lotus Elise, unveiled at the 1995 Frankfurt Motor Show, named after his granddaughter Elisa, had an innovative bonded aluminium chassis weighing just 725 kilograms. It became Lotus's all-time bestseller, with approximately 35,000 eventually built. Chapman would have recognised it instantly. A car built on the principle that subtracting weight makes you faster everywhere. But Bugatti's bankruptcy forced Artioli to sell within months. Malaysian car maker Proton acquired an 80% stake in October 1996 for £51 million. The deal reportedly sealed in 20 minutes. Under Proton, the Elise and Exige thrived. Then came Danny Bahar. The Turkish-born CEO, appointed in 2009, attempted to transform Lotus into a Ferrari rival, unveiling 5 new model concepts at the 2010 Paris Motor Show, backed by a £270 million loan. He was fired in June 2012 after the discovery of loan covenant breaches and allegations of excessive spending. All 5 model plans were cancelled. Another grand vision. Another spectacular collapse. The pattern was almost genetic by now. Chinese multinational Geely took a 51% controlling stake on 24th of May 2017, investing over £2 billion, including more than $100 million modernising Hethel. A factory in Wuhan with 150,000 unit capacity was built for electric vehicles. The Lotus Emira, the final internal combustion Lotus, entered production in 2022 and reached its 10,000th unit in December 2024, making it the fastest produced model in the company's history. The Evija electric hypercar, limited to 130 units at £2.5 million each, is built at Hethel. The Eletre SUV and Emea GT are built in Wuhan. Total 2,024 deliveries reached 12,134 vehicles. Revenue hit £670 million. The operating loss was approximately £786 million. And then the cuts came. 270 jobs in early 2025. 550 more in August. The workforce reduced to approximately 750 from a peak of 1,345 in late 2019. South Norfolk MP Ben Goldsborough called the cuts a punch in the stomach, but noted, The worst-case scenarios, the complete closure of the factory, have been avoided. Deliveries in the first quarter of 2025 collapsed to 1,274 units, down 42% year-on-year. Production was paused from mid-May to August due to American tariff impacts. The company has never been sustainably profitable in its modern era. A 2.1-ton Chinese-built electric SUV now bears the badge of a man who believed subtracting weight made you faster everywhere. The contradiction doesn't need stating. It simply exists, like the factory itself. Still there, still producing, still losing money, still beautiful in the way that things which shouldn't have survived are beautiful. Hethel Chapman, who built the Mark I and Mark II with her own hands, who invested that £25, who outpaced Colin in trials, signed off the 100,000th Lotus road car in 2018. She died on the 13th of December 2021, aged 94. 3 days before the 39th anniversary of Colin's death. The annual Lotus Remembered Staff Reunion, its fourth iteration held in September 2025, brings together workers from across the decades. The former mechanics still care for championship-winning machines in a building across Potash Lane from the main factory, where Clive Chapman runs Classic Team Lotus. A heritage centre and museum is planned, with Colin Chapman's original office to be restored. You can book a factory tour for £95 or £140 combined with the heritage experience. Corners on the test track are named after Graham, Hill, Andretti and Senna. The test track itself stretches 2.2 miles around the old bomber base. The main straight is the original wartime runway, the same concrete where B-24 Liberators once taxied for raids over occupied Europe, where young Americans from Colorado lined up to fly to their deaths, where 588 men left and didn't come back. After the war, it lay abandoned for 20 years. Then a man who couldn't pass his maths exam landed a plane on it and saw a test track where others saw ruins. Every Lotus road car, from the Europa to the Emira, has been validated on that strip. It's a requirement written into Geely's acquisition agreement. The track has outlasted Chapman. It's outlasted every scandal, every bankruptcy, every owner. It's outlasted the fraud, the cocaine, the heart attack, the silence. The concrete is cracked in places now, patched and repaired over decades, but it holds. Across the flat Norfolk farmland, the medieval All Saints Church contains the 389th Bombardment Group's Roll of Honour. Polish graves from displaced wartime refugees share the churchyard with the Hethel Old Thorn, reportedly East Anglia's oldest hawthorn tree. Inside the former gymnasium, Bud Doyle's crucifix from 1944 still hangs on the wall. A memorial to young men who came from Colorado and never went home. Colin Chapman came from Hornsey. He built cars behind a pub, married the woman who helped him build them, revolutionised Formula One, created some of the most beautiful machines Britain has ever produced, stole millions of pounds meant for one of the most deprived communities in Western Europe, and died before anyone could make him answer for it. The £25 that Hethel invested in 1953 built a legend. The $77 million that the British taxpayer lost on DeLorean nearly destroyed it. The test track doesn't care about any of that. It's just concrete. It does what concrete does. It endures. And every morning at Hethel, if they're running cars, you can still hear the engines on the straight. The sound carries across the Norfolk fields, past the church, past the memorial, past the old dispersal bays where the brambles have long since won. It's the sound of something that shouldn't still be here, but is.